The Galactic Empire had more resources than possibly any other galactic government in history. Whatever it needed, it could obtain. It controlled resources, banks, agriculture, and generally could obtain anything. But what would have happened if the unthinkable happened, and the Empire's economy went bust? It ran out of resources, so to say. Complete bankruptcy. Now, how exactly this rethink is going to work is difficult to say. We've talked about numerous times on this channel just about how powerful the Empire was, and how it kind of micromanages the entire galaxy. Almost any industry or anything with some level of strategic or financial importance to the galaxy, the Empire in some ways was affiliated with and exercised some level of control over. You see, although there were independent companies out there, Kuat Drive Yards, the Mining Guild, Cloud City, the banks, and these are independent, but the Imperials are still involved, and these organisations knew better than to poke that sleeping bear. They do whatever the Empire asked, as the consequences for not doing so would likely cost them everything they had, including their lives. Now, this command structure does mean that it is generally pretty hard for the Empire to go bankrupt. Almost impossible. At the end of the day, resources and wealth are rarely destroyed outright, and when the Empire in some way controls almost everything, it's pretty easy for them to get it back. We know that the Empire controlled the banks, so for this reason, it could get as in debt as they wanted, and at the end of the day, if they couldn't pay it back, then they would just write it off. It's very poor economic skills in the grand scheme of things, but it worked pretty well for them, especially in the short term. But for this theory, we're going to be saying that the Imperials somehow managed to tank their economy. Maybe there's some sort of plague, or natural disaster, or maybe some form of large-scale conflict with another galactic superpower from outside of the Star Wars galaxy, like the Yuzong Vong. Now, the Empire will win this conflict, but it's crippled. Huge portions of its resources have been destroyed. They haven't gained any territory or resources from it. The financial backbone of the galaxy is effectively wiped out, and a massive recession ensues. For this reason, the Empire and the galaxy in general is, like it or not, more or less bankrupt. Now, first things first is we need to understand the Empire's not just going to take this lying down. They're just going to become more draconian in how they rule. They will seize assets entirely. Whereas before, they may just demand huge amounts of taxes and tributes and tithes, they will simply move to take over farms, factories, arresting or intimidating their owners until they can take 100% of the asset and keep all of the profits. Effectively, everything would become state-owned. And needless to say, it doesn't matter how badly damaged the Empire and the galaxy is financially, if they do just keep on plundering all of the healthy assets, then they are going to be able to stay afloat. And this is something that the Empire could and probably would do. However, this is going to cost them in the long run. For one, all of those big businesses that are incredibly powerful and pretty rich had previously been pretty happy to support the Empire. They could look past all of the autocratic fascist nonsense because they were making a lot of money. But they're going to become a lot less friendly now. Kuat Drive Yards, for example, they made a fortune off the Empire, but now that the Empire is just seizing assets and doing whatever it wants, far more directly, it's likely going to begin to fear for its position. How long until the Empire comes and steals their beloved shipyards? For this reason, we have to imagine there's going to be a great deal of resentment, and this resentment will eventually bubble over into conflict, but we'll get onto that in a minute. Now, the everyday citizens of the galaxy would also be doing no better. The Empire is going to need more labour, particularly free labour, because, as I said, they're bankrupt, so they can't really afford to pay workers. For this reason, they're gonna start making people do slave labour. Trumped up charges and just generally kidnapping people is probably what's gonna happen. Entire colonies. And for those who they don't arrest, they will be taxed beyond all belief. It's likely people's homes and possessions and everything in between will be seized and repossessed by the Imperials. That cool new ship you bought? Cool, we're gonna melt it down and turn it into parts for a Star Destroyer hull. At the end of the day, we are also having to think here that if all of these people are being made homeless, if all of their possessions have been taken, and if they're fleeing the Imperials enslaving them, then there is going to be a huge refugee crisis. Now, hard times cause political distress, and this means that freedom-fighting groups, rebellions, and insurgencies will be growing like weeds at a rate that is completely unfounded before. and the Empire, meanwhile, will be struggling to fight these. Sure, they may be able to stay afloat for quite a while by taking it out on their own citizens and loyal neutral companies, but after a while these are going to dry up and they are going to be difficult to replenish. Remember how I said that they will take over these big companies and plan to keep 100% of the profits? Well, the big problem here is that during the age of the Empire, majority of these big companies' biggest customers was the Empire. And at the end of the day, if the Empire takes over and it's already in financial distress, realistically, it's not going to be making much of a profit. Firstly, the Imperials are bureaucrats. They're not very good at running companies in an effective way. They're good at, enforcing a tyrannical regime. So the idea that they could run something like Kuat drive yards effectively is probably just off the table. And at the same time, if they're spending all of their money helping the Imperials aren't going to pay themselves for their own work, so it really is just a cut and go. And this means that inevitably all of these companies that were incredibly valuable are now basically worthless because the empires have stripped them of all value to maintain their terror state. Now back onto these freedom fighting groups, they're going to have themselves some new friends, particularly powerful friends. Those wealthy tycoons who the Imperials were robbing and stealing the assets of are likely going to start funneling their remaining assets into these insurgencies. At the end of the day, if the Empire doesn't make them rich, then they don't want it anymore. Very similarly to how the Separatists behaved with the Republic in the early years. The Empire now poses a threat to their bottom line, so it needs to go. Ultimately, I think it's very, very likely that the Empire could not survive this sort of distress. It is important to acknowledge that it's a very robust government, however, that could survive the situation for as long as the Empire could. Realistically, I can't think of any galactic government that could have survived this. Possibly the Republic, but unlikely. But at the end of the day, I honestly don't see the Empire surviving this sort of economic downturn. It's very likely that we would see the Imperial warlords split off into smaller factions, tearing each other apart, whilst a newer government steps in to fix it. Probably something far more democratic, similar to the Republic, or something that is company-run, similar to the Separatists. Or just another tyrannical authoritarian regime like the Empire, but one that maybe manages people a little better. But what do you guys think? Could the Empire survive this? And what do you think would happen if it did go bankrupt? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, I really do hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please remember to like, share and sub, as it is really appreciated and it helps the channel grow. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at @TheLawGuy and tick the bell to get regular updates whenever I do upload new content. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching this video today, I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you're all staying safe, and I'll see you next time.